So as the semester is rapidly drawing to a close, we'd like to welcome you to our final single presenter lecture. Next week, we will close out with 2 panel discussions, but tonight we will hear from a young scholar in the field of Black psychology. This lecture is one in a long line of year-long virtual presentations honoring the 50th anniversary of the Department of Black Studies here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. In 1971, this department formally opened, but that is not the beginning of the story. 1968 witnessed the creation of the first Department of Black Studies at San Francisco State University. Its founding was the result of several previous years of protests and demands by Black students for a course of study and approaches to research that reflected the cultural and social understandings of Black people globally and historically, but which also provided a means for improving the current lives of those same people. Then, as now, it was a time of social reckoning and accountability. That reckoning and accountability made its way to Omaha, Nebraska, and like at San Francisco State and other campuses around the country, Black students at UNO demanded to be acknowledged and their experiences recognized, and so the protests began. Then, on November 10th, 1969, 54 Black UNO students staged a sit-in in the president's office for his failure to address issues of racial discrimination and cultural relevance on this campus. While peacefully protesting, the police were called and all 54 students were arrested. The arrest of the Omaha 54 gave the student population and Omaha's Black community a cause to rally around. Omaha's Black civic and social organizations and churches came together to bail out all of the 54 students, as well as stand behind them in their negotiations with the university. One of their demands was the creation of a Department of Black Studies. And 2 years later, as a result of their continued demands and pressure on the university's administration, in the fall of 1971, this department came into existence, making it one of the oldest Black studies departments in this country and one of the very few in the entire Great Plains region. And here we are, 50 years strong, looking back on where we have been, looking ahead to the path that the discipline of Black studies has created, and looking around for ways to be of service to the community. It is because of the courage of 54 students that this department exists, and it is because of the unwavering support of Omaha's Black community then and now that this department continues to exist. We salute you and we thank you. As a discipline born of protest and called upon from the very beginning to study, analyze, and critique the continuing effects of historical enslavement, colonization, land dispossession, and corporate imperialism, we cannot help but acknowledge that this university and the city itself sits on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American people for whom this city is named, the Omaha, and that of other First Nation people who regarded this land as their communal homeland. We stand in solidarity with you. Finally, we stand in solidarity with those who seek the truth, those who seek to know the truth, those who seek to tell the truth, and most importantly, those who seek to teach the truth. It is not the role of education to make people comfortable. It is to bring light to darkness and to make our existence on this planet better for all of its inhabitants. We will not pander in, nor will we tolerate lies or half-truths. We stand solidly and firmly on the side of Ma'at, which is truth, fairness, justice, and fair dealing, especially when it comes to our children. All children, our future and theirs require nothing less. So with that, I turn to the speaker for tonight, Dr. Bridget Cheeks. Dr. Cheeks is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate students in parenting and adolescent development courses. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from Bowling Green State University and the Master's of Science and PhD degrees in psychology from the University of Michigan. As a graduate student at the University of Michigan, she studied under and gained experience from prominent Black psychology scholars who are examining Black youth racial discrimination experiences, parental racial socialization, and youth racial identity development. Following in this line, Dr. Cheeks wrote the dissertation, The Relationships Between African-American Adolescents' Daily Racial Discrimination, Daily Racial Socialization, and Racial Identity with Academic and Psychological Outcomes. And in her current position at UNC Greensboro, she continues her work to examine racial socialization processes within African-American families and positive youth development. Most recently, Dr. Cheeks has been awarded a 3-year collaborative National Science Foundation grant to work with Black families who have been impacted by racial violence in Missouri and Virginia. She is dedicated to Black empowerment and incorporating history into her teaching while working to improve the well-being and academic success of Black youth. Welcome, Dr. Cheeks.
Thank you so much.
All right, so as is our habit, we're gonna start out with a few conversational questions and then I'll turn the presentation over to you. So my first question to you is, what made you study or decide that you wanted to study psychology?
I was very fortunate to have my first opportunity to take my first psychology course when I was in high school. I attended Renaissance High School in Detroit, Michigan. It's a public high school, a college preparatory high school. And I took a psychology course, I think it was my senior year. I was really inspired by my teacher then, Miss Bailey Fakori, and I think she's actually Dr. Bailey Fakori now. I remember her telling us that she studied psychology in college and she was a young Black teacher. So she was someone who I could relate to, and she just was really inspiring to me. And I was very intrigued just by the general content of psychology. I was really interested in learning about disorders, personality disorders, and learning about Freud's theory. And then when I got into college, I really got introduced to Black psychologists, and that really opened my world of knowledge about what I could do in my own career. So I majored in psychology in college. I did research assistantships as an undergraduate student. I participated in summer programs like the McNair program and summer research opportunity program. And all of those different experiences really helped guide my trajectory in psychology and research.
All right, so who are some of the scholars in the field of Black psychology that you look up to or who influenced you?
There are so many, and I definitely will talk more about some of the scholars' previous work that has inspired me and motivated me in my presentation today. But I can just highlight even my own mentors and advisors at the University of Michigan. Coming across them, reading about their work while I was in college that really focused on Black people and their experiences, focused on Black college students, racial identity development, talking about racism and racial discrimination, but also empowerment. And I really gravitated towards scholars who discussed the cultural strengths within the Black community and within ourselves. And so I worked with my mentors, Dr. Tabby Chavis, Dr. Robert Sellers at the University of Michigan. They have been studying things like racial socialization within Black families, identity development, Black positive youth development for decades now. And they have trained me, mentored me, and we are colleagues now. They developed one of the most popular conceptual models of racial identity among Black Americans, the multidimensional model of racial identity that I use a lot in my work. Also inspired by Dr. Velma McBride Murray, Dr. Jacqueline Matisse. She was my postdoctoral mentor at the University of Michigan, and her work has focused more on Black women and thinking about how Black women are resilient and use spirituality to be resilient. Dr. Margaret Bill Spencer, I will highlight some of her work in my presentation, definitely have inspired or guided, my work with her conceptual model.
So my final question, and I'll turn it over to you after that, and you'll probably be answering this in your presentation, but could you tell us what is racial socialization and how is it that you came to decide that that's what you wanted to focus your research on?
Yes, so racial socialization is the process of communicating something about race to someone else. It is also the content of those racial messages. There are different types of racial socialization messages that I will talk about in the presentation today. Usually when racial socialization is examined in research, the focus has primarily been on the racial socialization messages that parents give to their children or their adolescents during the adolescent period when race might start to become even more salient in children's lives. And so thinking about the conversations around race, what it means to be Black is all involved in the racial socialization that I study. And the last part of the question, why I decided to focus on it, I think it goes back to my early interest in psychology and identity development. In my upbringing, growing up in Detroit, learning about racial injustices that have occurred, that are currently being faced, that continue to be faced by Black people, that really provided me with an important context, I think, where I developed my interests and motivations. I became concerned with injustices, with racism and discrimination and the implications of those things. So with achievement gaps, with poverty rates that Black people face. So I felt like a lot of those issues that we know have been deeply ingrained within American society based on racist policies, that felt those micro level experiences felt too big for me to tackle. And so I wanted to focus on, okay, we know that discrimination exists. What are the factors that allow someone to continue on, to be successful, to remain persistent and remain determined despite things like experiences of racial discrimination? So what are the resilience factors that are particularly tied to race? How do youth develop those kinds of beliefs? And so one of those factors that might influence racial identity beliefs, or the ways in which you think about what it means to be Black and the importance of being Black, to me, the significance of it within my self-concept, one factor that influences those beliefs is racial socialization. And so I then wanted to get further detailed in trying to understand the process of racial socialization. And so I will just start sharing my screen. And so I want to focus my talk today around what racial socialization is. I will talk about that some more. And what are the implications, importantly, of racial socialization for Black youth? This is just an outline of my talk today. So I will start off going into a little more detail about my research interests and motivations to answer the questions. What is racial socialization? What is this about? Why does it matter? Why should we care about it? I will talk about some of my previous work, and this actually was a published manuscript that was based on my dissertation work that examined the impact of Black adolescents' daily racial experiences. I'll briefly describe two studies that I'm currently working on and that I'm really excited about. And then I will talk about what I think is up next for me in my future. And then I'll end with some discussion and take home messages, and hopefully that ignites some questions and want to answer the questions of where my work fits in and what are the implications of this work. And so socialization is one of those central responsibilities of the family. We primarily think of parents as being the primary socializing agents of their children, most typically, but then also other family members. There are other sources of socialization that we can think of, like the media can provide socialization, friends and peers can provide socialization to youth, teachers can provide socialization to youth. And this is providing teachings that allows youth to understand the behaviors, the beliefs that are relevant, that are important, meaningful, valued within their cultural context, within their environments and within their society. So everyone gets some type of socialization. Families socialize youth around a whole range of important things that we tend to care about. Families socialize youth around academics and what it means to get an education. Youth might get socialization around their religious beliefs or their spirituality from their parents and family members. We might get gender socialization. So we're learning, we get socialization about the occupations. We give youth socialization about preparing for their future occupations, for example. So socialization is really important. It's really important, particularly in some critical developmental periods, like in adolescence, like in emerging adulthood. And so these are the areas that I have typically studied. And so adolescents, thinking about youth who are around 10 through 18, that can further be split up between early adolescence and late adolescence. And emerging adults, traditionally aged college students, we tend to describe as emerging adults, those who are prolonging their delay into adulthood and making those commitments of adulthood. So we're thinking about college students who are young, typically 18 to 25 years old. So particularly in these critical developmental periods, when youth are really being exposed to differences in races and cultures, having different interactions outside of the household that might that they might perceive some discrimination from. So race, culture, at one's ethnicity differences are more salient during the adolescent, during the emerging adult periods. And so thinking about all the ways that youth are socialized happens among Black American families, just like any other families. My focus specifically within Black families brings in the importance of race within the lives of Black youth and Black families. And so this slide details some of the theories that have guided my thinking, my work over the years. Scholars who have talked about what it means to be Black in America for many, many years. W.E.B. Du Bois talking about the double consciousness and grappling with what it means to be both Black and American. Boykin has a framework called the triple quandary, where there are 3 realms of experience. And so Boykin talks about Black parents tend to socialize children around these 3 different realms of experience: the mainstream experience, so that would be socializing children to fit into mainstream culture in some way. That can be teaching them the rules about what it means to navigate a traditional public school system in America. Minority experience, these can include socialization messages that are around what it means to be a racial minority within American context. So these messages can get at what is racism, what is discrimination, how should I prepare myself for that kind of experience? And then cultural messages or realms of experience has to do with within the Black culture. What are the teachings do parents want to impart to their developing youth that's specifically about their Black heritage, their Black ancestry, particular values or belief systems, ways of doing things within this particular culture? And I mentioned Margaret Beale Spencer earlier. Her PVEST, this phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory. It's a mouthful to say, but this was one of my guiding theories of my dissertation research. And I continue to use this theory to guide me because what Dr. Spencer did was take a theory that really didn't talk about the impact of race or the impact of gender or ethnicity in Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. She adapted that classic theory to include the importance of race in particular for Black adolescents' development, knowing that having some experience that has to do with being Black is a normative experience for the development of Black youth. So highlighting that there are risk factors or risk contributors that might be related to youth, race, and gender. And so these are the experiences or the messages that youth might get about themselves from an outside environment that communicate something to them. So there are these risk factors, risk contributors, but there are also these supports that Dr. Spencer talks about. There can be these internal assets, so something that youth have within themselves, something that has been instilled. We might think of like trait-related characteristics, belief systems. And there are also these external resources that youth might have access to. These are what is outside the individual that can provide support for their positive developmental outcomes. And one example of that outside resource, external support, could be parents' racial socialization that helps them to deal with, to understand, and to deal with in an effective way, an adaptive way, or in a healthy way, the impact of any risk contributor, which an example of that can be racial discrimination. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when we can talk about socialization broadly, socialization around a whole lot of things, I'm going to talk about specifically racial socialization within Black American or African American households. There have been scholars who studied the frequency and the content of messages that are most typical within African American households. And again, when we think about racial socialization, it's not only the content of the messages of what's being communicated to youth, but it's also the process by which the racial socialization happens, the process by which that information is communicated to youth. These are just some examples of different types of racial socialization messages that scholars have studied over many decades. There have been conceptualizations by Hughes that has looked at racial socialization with two broad umbrellas, one being preparation for racial bias. And these can include messages like racial barrier messages that teach youth that racial discrimination exists, teaches youth about racism. And there can be messages that fall within this umbrella that provide ways of coping with discrimination. And the other umbrella being cultural socialization. Some of the messages that might fall under this are like racial pride, giving youth information about their heritage, about the group's accomplishments, about their history. All of that can be incorporated within cultural socialization. And these are some other messages that I have looked at in my work. Self-worth messages teach youth or communicate to youth that they are somebody special just because they are an individual, that they are a unique individual. Egalitarian messages are the messages that teach youth that we should try to have racial harmony, that people of different races should treat each other fairly or equally. Negative messages, we tend not to see as high frequency. We tend to see very low frequency of negative messages within African American households, but they can still happen. Racial socialization can be transmitted in very explicit ways, like a parent sitting down with an adolescent and talking to them about a racial discrimination event that happened to them. Or racial socialization, just like other forms of socialization, can happen in more implicit ways. The parent may make a comment, but not intending that comment for the child, but the child overhears it. That can still be a form of racial socialization. That message has gotten communicated to them. And so a negative message communicates negative stereotypes, negative beliefs about one's racial group. And behavioral messages are the things that we can think of that parents actually might do, or any socializing agent might do with the youth to teach them about what it means to be Black. This could be exposures to movies or documentaries, exposures to books or art or history, going to a museum, are all ways that children can get socialized around race. Thinking about why it's important to me, we see direct impacts on developmental outcomes based on the type of racial socialization that youth receives, and also based on the frequency. So there have been scholars who looked at the combination of different messages and compared those who have high frequency of messages to a low versus moderate, more positive messages. So there are a whole variety of ways that researchers over the years have examined this. And in general, when Black parents provide racial socialization to their developing youth, we see increases in a lot of positive outcomes. Things like academic achievement, things like self-esteem, the development of positive racial and ethnic identities, which is something I'm really interested too. Like, how do these messages influence how the youth is going to view themselves in a positive way? And racial socialization influences decreases in some of the more negative developmental outcomes that we can examine, like delinquency, drug abuse, and internalized racism. And so thinking about how can these conversations come up? How does this process of racial socialization work? Where we can think about what typically happens in everyday life. You turn on the TV and you see something, and that might spark a conversation. We know that over the past couple of years, we have seen images of mass protests that have been sparked by the murders of unarmed Black people in America. Those highly publicized events, seeing that on TV, or even youth participating in protests themselves, that can spark some of these racial socialization conversations. And we have seen that they indeed have. Just thinking about my own experience while I was in graduate school, it was during 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed. And I can remember being a student on a predominantly white college campus. This event happened that, shook a lot of young Black students, college students. We had on-campus protests, we had events to cope together, but thinking about those events as igniting my drive, my motivation for my continued research, to try to understand, okay, how can youth cope when they experience, or even when they view vicariously racial discrimination events or events of race-related violence that we might see. This was actually, when preparing for this talk, I went back to my dissertation. I had this as my first page, my dedication page in my dissertation, because the deaths of these Black people were very salient to me at the time. Around the same time of the 5 years of working on my PhD, the death of Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garden, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Renisha McBride, Oscar Grant. So it felt important to me to include this in my dedication and my dissertation, because this provided, I think, a context, a backdrop of why this research was so important to me. In addition to acknowledging my ancestors, my family, all the Black scholars who have paved the way for me, and all the Black scholars who will come after me. And so during that time of working on my graduate school work, this was very salient to me. And I think researchers in particular who study racial injustices or who talk about racism and discrimination, it can be very difficult. And so reminding ourselves too, the importance, why we do the things that we do, what we care about, how does that fit in with our own personal identities, that has helped me and guided my way and allowed me to know which direction that I really want to focus in. In addition to seeing news or events of racial violence, I see discussions about race in popular culture. And so this just shows an example article. There was a Blackish episode that really talked about issues of police brutality. We see it in our popular culture figures. So NBA players showing expressions of protest or expressions that there is some injustice, that's something that I want fixed. So youth are seeing this when they turn on the TV. There are commercials, and thinking about this is one example from Procter & Gamble's My Black is Beautiful campaign. So those were examples of how racial barrier messages, something that's communicating that discrimination is happening, but racial socialization is also encompassing a bunch of different messages like racial pride messages. So this My Black is Beautiful campaign really highlights and communicates racial pride messages, that being Black is beautiful, period. We see increased discussions of the importance of the talk. So where traditionally when parents have the talk with their children, they're talking about sex processes, reproductive processes, and in more contemporary times, I've been seeing in popular culture or popular media, the talk being described as this racial socialization talk. So I think it's something that's relevant, important, meaningful. It's really cool to see how see my research being expressed or displayed in these different media forms. In this last example, socialization can be communicated through books, through artwork that we give our children. I have a 2-year-old daughter, so in thinking about the kinds of racial socialization messages she's getting now, she has these 2 books that really highlight racial pride, self-worth. There are a lot of children's books that have to do with being an anti-racist, how to interact with others in peaceful ways and in egalitarian ways. But these are just 2 books that, that I thought of that are perfect examples that show Black racial pride within these beautiful pages of this book. And there are many others. So these are just some of the different ways and sources that children receive racial socialization. And so I want to get into talking about my previous work. And so again, this was work that was based on my dissertation. So for any students out there, you can do it. You can get your dissertation manuscript published. This was the first study from my dissertation. So it was a much more pared down, focusing on African-American adolescents' reports of their daily experiences with racial discrimination, their daily racial socialization, and their daily psychological affect. So this has been published in the Journal of Child Development. So it was really exciting. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what this study was highlighting. Thinking about past work that examines racial socialization, the work has tended to use longer retrospective reports where participants are typically asked on a survey to tell me, have you experienced this type of racial discrimination? Or have you experienced this, have you heard this racial socialization message from your parent over the past 6 months, over the past year, sometimes even over a lifetime? And so that long time that people are retrospectively thinking back, especially children and adolescents, that can introduce some respondent bias because there is asking about reports that they have to think so long back about, it's more likely that reports can be more inaccurate. They might not remember. So thinking about another method that can get at closer to when that actual experience happened is using something called a daily diary method. And we use this with this study. And so some of the analyses that I examined were to understand how daily racial discrimination impacted daily positive and negative daily emotions, how daily racial socialization messages also influence their daily positive and negative emotions, and then also how daily racial socialization messages might serve as a moderator, might change the impact of racial discrimination on daily positive or negative emotions. I examined this across the same days. And then I also looked at when the racial socialization message was received by the adolescent the day before the discrimination event happened. And so this study included a subsample of a larger longitudinal study of adolescents and their parents that was conducted by the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context that I worked in as a graduate student and a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Michigan. So the 164 self-identified African-American or Black American adolescents were a part of a larger study. They were randomly sampled to participate in a 21-day daily method. And so this included, for 21 days straight, they completed an online survey that was short, that just took them about 5 to 10 minutes to complete, asking them about what happened during that day. Did you experience this? Did you hear this message? How did you feel? Asking them that every day for the 21 days. And so a benefit of this daily diary method, we get, again, those assessments closer in time to when those experiences or when those interactions or communications actually happen. Another problem with research that has used longer term retrospective reports is that we may measure racial discrimination that happened over the past year, but researchers might relate that to an outcome that was assessed in the present year. And so just thinking about the timing, sometimes the temporal ordering is harder to talk about causality when we have measurements taken in different times and we're relating the experience to the outcome as if they happened close in time together. Using this daily diary method, this gives us the opportunity to actually look at that and to tease apart some of that temporal ordering sequence of events and outcomes. And so the measures that was included in this study, racial discrimination was measured by the Racism and Life Experiences Scale. This included 7 different items that asked about racial discrimination on that day. So each day out of the 21 days, the youth got the same items and they were asked, did you experience this today? Racial discrimination for the analysis was then dichotomized such that if a youth, for each day, if they said yes, they experienced any one of the 7 that they were asked, then they were coded as a 1. So to thinking about racial discrimination at the level of the day, did they experience racial discrimination this day or did they not experience racial discrimination on this day is how we were able to look at that. Racial socialization used 3 types of messages: racial pride, racial barrier, and self-worth messages that were assessed by the Racial Socialization Questionnaire for Teens. And so racial pride messages, again, the youth were responding to these questions each day, and they were asked, did your parent tell you something to suggest that you should be proud to be Black? Did your parent tell you something to suggest that racism against Black people exists? And did your parent tell you something to suggest that you are somebody special today? And every night, the adolescents reported what they experienced on that day. And then my outcome for this study was psychological affect measured by the positive and negative affect schedule. This had two subscales, the positive affect and negative affect. So we can think about this as a collection of positive or negative emotions. The positive affect scale consisted of the mean of 9 different positive emotions, like did you feel excited, or how often. This was measured on a Likert scale, how much they experienced feeling excited, strong, determined, inspired, alert, for example. And negative affect was measured with 8 different negative emotions, for example, nervous, irritable, ashamed, or afraid, or scared were examples of the negative emotions. And so the scores indicated, higher scores indicated more positive emotions or more negative emotions on that day. And so in that study, we had a lot of significant findings. So I would just highlight some of our key findings. So on days that adolescent reported experiencing racial discrimination, they also reported more negative emotions during that same day. So this is consistent with previous research that has looked at longer term retrospective reports to say that, yes, we know that experiencing racial discrimination can be a risk factor to poorer outcomes. In this case, more negative emotions experienced on the same day that adolescents reported experiencing discrimination. Also, then when we looked at the impact of the individual racial socialization messages, on days that adolescents reported receiving a self-worth messages from parents, they reported more positive emotions on that same day and fewer negative emotions on that same day. So this is showing self-worth message to be a promotive factor. It's something that looks like it's a good thing for youth to have. When they get a self-worth message on that same day, they report that they feel more positive emotions. And also on that same day, they report that they feel fewer negative emotions. This was a really interesting finding in thinking about the same day relations between racial discrimination and negative affect. And this was moderated by the previous day racial pride. So I'll just orient you to this chart. So on this x-axis, we have no discrimination or among youth who don't experience any discrimination, and then also a group of youth who do experience discrimination. And then the yellow bar indicates the youth reported that they did not get a racial pride message on the day prior before the discrimination. And the blue bar indicates that the youth did receive a racial pride message. And so the red bar here is highlighting where I found that significant interaction. And so on the days that adolescents experience racial discrimination, we see a significant difference when we compare those who didn't receive a previous day racial pride message compared to those who did receive a previous day racial pride message, where those who did receive a racial pride message on the previous day reported more negative emotions on the next day when they experienced racial discrimination. So this finding was very interesting because it's actually counter to our hypotheses. It's actually counter to a lot of conceptualizations of the ways racial pride messages work. We tend to think of racial pride messages as being promotive, as being good, factors that would influence positive outcomes. In this case, when youth experience racial discrimination, if they got a racial pride message from their parents on the day before, they felt more negative emotions compared to youth who did not get that racial pride message the day before. And so in thinking about this finding, it reminds me of some findings from some past studies by Enrique Neblett, who has done a lot of research with Black youth and racial socialization. And he had one finding that where racial pride looked to be exacerbating poor academic outcomes in the context of discrimination. And so I think one way that we can think about this is knowing that this method, again, looking at the level of the specific day. So that can be a reason why we see different findings from research that has used longer term retrospective reports, because we're really seeing the impact immediately following this discrimination event and the racial pride message. So although racial pride messages are typically promotive in past research, that research has looked at longer term retrospective processes. So we can think about racial pride messages are important for the development of positive racial identity beliefs over time. As youth get more racial pride messages, they tend to have more positive feelings about what it means to be Black over time. So this finding is not to say that racial pride messages are not important or shouldn't be imparted, but it's just that it seems to be functioning differently in the short term than it does in longer term studies. And then also thinking about the experience of this. So if a youth, receives racial pride messages from their parents the day before, then the next day they experience something that communicates that their race is devalued. And thinking about what that experience would be like, it does make sense that, if we think about this is an identity that I've been told from my parents that I should be proud of, but then the next day someone disrespects me or devalues that identity, then it makes sense that a youth would feel hurt, experience more negative emotions in the short term, although racial pride messages may be protective for youth in more longer term assessments. And then there's a last finding from this study that I will highlight that was really exciting and was consistent with our hypotheses. This is the same kind of analyses. The only difference here is that the message is racial barrier messages. And so this message about teaching youth that racial discrimination exists, that it happens. And so there have been scholars who talked about the importance of racial barrier messages for Black youth, for their preparation, so they know how to respond, so they know how to navigate certain situations, so they know how to remain safe in situations. And so this finding is showing the opposite effect. So it is showing the protective buffering functioning of this prior day racial socialization message. We see this yellow bar. So among the adolescents who, when they experienced racial discrimination, we can see those who did not get a previous day racial barrier message had more negative emotions compared to youth who did get a previous day racial barrier message. So in this case, this group was protected. Those who received that previous day racial barrier message, they didn't experience as many negative emotions when they experienced discrimination as did the youth who didn't get that racial barrier message the previous day. So this just shows the ordering of experiences and measuring outcomes is important. It shows that racial barrier messages in this context, in this short-term assessment, suggest that it is a protective message that can buffer, or in this case, protect youth who experience racial discrimination from experiencing high levels of negative emotions. That might be because they're better prepared to deal with it because of those previous conversations that they had with their parents. I'll just briefly touch on some of my current work. One is a collaborative research project that was recently funded by the National Science Foundation to examine Black parents' racial socialization competencies. So how confident are parents in their ability to provide racial socialization to youth, particularly when they're in a context that within their communities, they have experienced highly publicized, racialized, violent events. And my colleagues, Dr. Sharita Butler-Barnes, Dr. Shauna Leith, are also on the grant too. Dr. Sharita Butler Barnes is leading this effort. And when we were writing this grant, we were really inspired by the protests that were happening in Missouri and Ferguson after the murder of Mike Brown. And so I'm thinking about, okay, when these highly publicized, racialized events happen, how does that change how parents racially socialize their youth? Does that increase it? Does that limit what they say? Do youth come to them? We're interested in the process of how it happens, how youth characteristics like their gender also might impact how parents might feel, or the types of messages parents might provide to their youth. And so this study will be over the next 3 years. It will include 1,000 Black parents and adolescents in their early adolescence. It will consist of annual surveys over the 3 years, as well as interviews that we'll have with the youth and parents in the last year. And so that mixed method will really help us provide some rich context to be able to hear their voices and understand how awareness or exposures of those racially violent events have impacted their racial socialization practices and how that relates to adolescents' outcomes. And another study that I am currently working on is the Racial Experiences in College Transition Study. I'm really excited about this. So I have finished the first phase, which consisted of African-American first-year college students who completed an online survey that had to do with their racial socialization experiences over the past year. And so in this instance, I really was interested, okay, in this, when students are coming into a new context for the first time, first-year college students, you know, with everything going on in society, I would imagine parents have increased their racial socialization when they know their, you know, young adults are going to be off to college, going to be interacting with different people, experiencing different things. They want them to be safe. And so I really wanted to understand what those first year college students' experiences of racial socialization was like. I asked them about the racial socialization, not only from their parents, but from all family members. And so I'm really excited to get into that data to know more about what's the racial socialization like from your sister, from your brother, from your cousin, from your grandmother, because we know extended family is very important to many Black families. So getting outside of only examining parents' racial socialization to moving to look at how does the extended family racially socialize youth, especially when they are transitioning to a college context. And the phase 2 we are currently in, this includes a small subsample of those students who completed phase 1, and they are in a 15-day daily study. And so they're receiving a survey every day for 15 days. I think we are in like day 9 right now. And so they are completing that. So I get measurements of their daily experiences on campus, in the academic environment, in the community, their experiences with racial discrimination. And also another important thing in this study that's included that I think will have a big contribution is getting assessments, understanding the impact of vicarious forms of racial discrimination and racial socialization, particularly that have been communicated to young emerging adults over social media, over different media sources. And so this can be videos that were played over social media where they were exposed to the killing of an unarmed Black person. Or it could be positive racial socialization messages that they see on social media that expresses that they should be proud to be a Black woman or a Black man. So I'm getting measurements of some socialization that's happening outside of family context in this social media world. So that will be a really exciting study, and I will be able to look at different multi-level models with having data on the daily level and then from a longer survey. In thinking about my future work, what I'm planning to do next, I will be developing relationships with community partners in Greensboro and in North Carolina communities. And so here at UNCG, wanting to get involved in the community. And at UNCG, there are a lot of researchers and scholars who do really great community engaged research. And so getting input from community members, getting their voices, understanding youth experiences in this particular community, understanding what the needs of the communities are, but particularly stakeholders. Those are things that I'm doing right now to further expand my research. Will continue to use longitudinal mixed method designs, person-centered approaches. As I mentioned, the importance of development and critical developmental periods of the adolescent period, the emerging adult period. And so having longitudinal approaches and studies can help us examine these processes over time. Having mixed methods designs, so like in the NSF study, getting that interview data, I will be able to possibly help explain the relationships that I find in my statistical analysis. I can provide some rich context through the information that's gathered through the parent and adolescent interviews. And I think person-centered approaches are also really important, and within group approaches. And so getting away from comparative research that can really have an influence on deficit framings, I really want to highlight the cultural strengths within the Black community, within Black families, and within Black individuals. Highlighting within group experiences also allows us to understand variation and know that there is so much great diversity within Black people. So having within group designs, person-centered approaches can allow us to have an understanding of within group. What are the variations of racial discrimination experiences across adolescence? What are the variations in the types of messages that parents give to boys and girls? And so understanding that diversity also is really important to me. And then lastly, I will be continuing learning from my students here at UNCG in this very unique academic context. We are a minority serving institution, a MSI. So at least 50% of our students are students of color. And so that provides a very different context than what a lot of this research has been based in, at least with college students, those who are attending large, predominantly white campuses. So how do these experiences, how do these interactions play out on a minority serving institution? And in my courses, within my Department of Human Development and Family Studies, there is probably the most diversity among faculty and students in the country. We are an extremely diverse department. And so in my courses, and when I teach undergraduate courses and graduate courses in adolescent development, and a course called Issues in Parenting, where we really talk about racial socialization experiences a lot. And in my course, both of those courses, I have 85 students, and about half of my class are typically Black women. And so, and then there's a lot of other racial ethnic diversity. And so we are predominantly women, but it's a lot of racial and ethnic diversity, and also a lot of Black women in my courses. And so just having that experience in classes to talk with them is informing my research, just as like my research also informs my teaching of them. And lastly, just a small discussion and some take-home messages about where did this work fit? What are the implications? And so I view my research as contributing to contemporary research on the lived experiences of Black youth, parents, and college students. And so thinking back to Dr. Spencer's PVEST model, there are risk contributors, but there are supports and assets and resources. And so we know discrimination exists. I don't know who's going to eliminate discrimination, but I know that there are also cultural and racial assets and resources that can be helpful and that are helpful. And so I want to highlight those cultural racial assets, these internal things that we all have inside of us that pushes us, that motivates us. If we face obstacles like discrimination, that allows us to keep going, like our racial identity beliefs, and also these external resources like racial socialization that can come from the youth environment. I think that this research really shows the reasons for using innovative methods, prioritizing within group examinations, like I just discussed, but also the importance of daily examinations. And so we learned a lot from, and we continue to learn a lot from longer term retrospective reports of experiences. But getting this information at the level of the particular day can really add great value to this research area. Racial socialization is dynamic. It can be highly influenced by what's currently going on in society. So if we're able to capture experiences, interactions at the level of the specific day, we can have a lot of contextual information to then be able to speak towards, okay, what is the process of racial socialization? How does this happen? In terms of implications, I hope and I see my research being applicable across a lot of different settings. My research can be used within school settings. And so thinking about policies that schools might enact around discrimination policies or within bullying policies. My research around the importance of cultural teachings and teaching history can be informative to curriculum development. I'm really interested in African-centered schools and the use of Black history to teach children and not only the things that they need to know to navigate America, but life skills. This research can be used within youth organizations, within mentoring initiatives, providing role models or having a sense of what the types of exposures that can be most helpful to youth. And we can get specific, you know, so we can think about what might be the most helpful messages for Black girls in this particular city who are dealing with this particular racial event that was really, really hurtful to their community. So I want to, again, partner with community organizations with initiatives that support the positive development of Black youth specifically. And then lastly, in parenting courses and workshops, I think that this information can be really informative and helpful. A lot of times parents don't even know where to start. You know, these conversations about race, about discrimination can be hurtful. Our parents might be dealing with their own traumatic experiences from the workplace. And so then how do they talk about these things with their adolescent? How do they approach the subject? How do they get their adolescent to listen to them actually? So all of these things I can see my research as having implications for, and I hope to contribute to these different areas in the future. And I'll just end with some acknowledgements to first definitely thank the adolescents, the parents, and the college students who participated in all of these studies that I've been a part of. Without their information, without them giving of their knowledge and talking about their experiences, we wouldn't have this information. The National Science Foundation that has funded a lot of this work and has supported the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context, as well as my current study. And I want to thank my mentors and the main PIs in the CISBIC, Dr. Tabby Chavis and Dr. Robert Sellers, the Office of Research Engagement here at UNCG Greensboro, and my department, my home department, Human Development and Family Studies, my wonderful colleagues here, who a lot of my colleagues do some related research and focus on positive functioning within Black families and positive youth development, and our wonderful graduate students who have helped me as assistants on these projects. So thank you. Thank you all for your time and listening, and I would love to answer any questions that have come up.
Thank you, Dr. Cheeks. That was phenomenal. And it's very, very important work that you're doing because like you said, who's going to eliminate racism? You know, so it's a thing that exists within our society that we have to prepare our children to deal with and to deal with effectively. So there is a question in the Q&A from Professor Karen Johns. What are some examples of discrimination that the first year students experienced?
Okay. Some of the examples that I asked them about, so thinking about some of the most frequent experiences, being stared at, viewed as, you know, I'm trying to remember the exact item, but being viewed in a suspicious way. And I think that we can understand, you know, based on different racial stereotypes of young Black adults. And, you know, we can think of the different racial stereotypes that are placed on young Black men in particular as being more threatening or being criminal just by being Black and being a young Black man. And so I remember that being a highly frequent experience. So they were questions that were not just based on the academic setting, but I definitely think that can be one that occurred on a setting, but this asks about discrimination in general in public spaces. And so that has been usually one that comes up a lot, being stared at in public spaces, not given service in restaurants or not getting adequate service in restaurants. Being one common experience that comes up within college campuses or the classroom is being mistaken by somebody of your same race. So if you're in a college campus and there's only 2 Black students in that class and the professor calls you the other Black student's name, you know, so you're not telling us apart, or, you know, you're not learning our names, has come up as a common, being treated like a token, and particularly when thinking about on larger, predominantly white campuses, feeling like, or having experiences where other students, white students or professors, either don't view you as a student there, that you shouldn't be here, or that you're only here because you're an athlete, or you're only here because you got a scholarship, or because of affirmative action. And so not acknowledging students' intellect or their own abilities to get them to that academic space are some other common experiences.
All right, so I did have a couple of questions, and I was wondering, and I guess I can divide this up into 2 questions. So thinking about the parents, their role in preparation, so preparation for racial bias. Was there a particular, or did you notice if there was a class dimension? Because if you think about it, that also kind of reflects where people live. Mm-hmm. So living in a predominantly Black community or a multiracial or predominantly white community, were you able to assess how parents in those different areas may have had different messages that they expressed to their children?
Yeah, I did look at that in my dissertation. And so in that first study that I described, the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context study, those parents and adolescents were from or lived in 3 different school districts that had great variability in their socioeconomic status, in the parents' education levels, in the racial composition of their neighborhoods and of the schools that the children were in. And so I think all of those factors can certainly be important. One of those findings that I remember is that among the parents who lived within the district that was characterized as more working class, that had more proportions of Black households, that they provided more racial socialization messages compared to parents who were in communities that were traditionally higher income level, traditionally white, upper and middle class populations. And so, yeah, I can think about so many different, reasons of why that might be, or why either education, socioeconomic status can be important in influencing either the racial beliefs that parent has, based on the parent's beliefs about what it means to be Black, how important it is. That's going to impact the types of messages that they give in part to their children. So those and more we might think of as labeled blue collar jobs, working class communities might have experienced particular types of racial discrimination, like higher surveillance of police, more disrespect, more ignoring of them in the workplace. But then at the same time, I can think of examples of how, parents who have high levels of education, higher incomes, thinking about their types of occupations that might be in the corporate world, where in their situation, they might be the only Black person in their environments. And so they might be experiencing racial discrimination too, in increased ways. That can be highly traumatic. That could limit what those parents are imparting to their children, so like maybe it's better to not talk about this. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about all the different characteristics that can influence when, why, if someone will talk about race to their children, or how they will talk about race. Yeah, and also regional differences I think about a lot. So as growing up in Detroit, Michigan, a predominantly Black city, I went to Black public high schools growing up. I had all Black teachers growing up, so the socialization that I received growing up around all Black people is very different than what, someone might receive that didn't have that type of environment. And so now that I'm in the southern part of the United States, I am really interested too in thinking about how region or, cultural variations based on region in the United States, or even based on city, can be influential in influencing parents. Yeah.
So kind of a follow-up to that question is dealing with the students themselves. And I'm thinking more about the college students. So did you notice with students based on their background, if they came from a predominantly Black background, home or school, or predominantly white neighborhood or school, their ability to perceive racial bias? Was there any distinction there?
Oh, that would be an interesting paper for me to look at. I have not examined the data yet, but I did ask where these first year students, I asked them where they're from. So that will allow me to try to examine, and a lot of our students are from North Carolina. So that will be interesting to see if I can examine that. In some previous work that I did at the University of Michigan, a part of the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context, or another study that was with Black college students at the time, and we participated, the graduate students, we interviewed current college students about their racial experiences, about how their social identities have helped them navigate the academic context. And I remember some of that coming up in their interviews, just thinking about some students who talked about growing up in a predominantly white high school, coming to a large predominantly white college campus. It wasn't that big of a difference for them in their experience. They were used to being tokenized or being viewed as different than their peers. But other students who were from predominantly Black areas, they talked about the culture shock of coming into a predominantly white campus and the different racial microaggressions that they would experience in their residence halls and in the academic classroom, in their advising sessions with counselors. Yeah, but I will keep that idea in mind, because I'm really interested in thinking about how, you know, where you're from and what your previous experiences have been are going to, you know, have some impact on then how you perceive your new environment.
Yeah, I think that'll be some really interesting research, because when you think about preparation even for college, and I'm thinking also about Professor Jasmine Watkins, who presented last week on self-efficacy in mathematics. And, you know, I wonder about the relationship between those factors as well, and your ability to perceive whether or not you will be successful in college, you know, not just even in mathematics, but if you'll be successful in college in general, having had that real strong positive socialization before you leave home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so I don't see any other questions. Professor Johns typed in chat, I didn't have a Black teacher until college. I had an art teacher in junior high that was Black. Yeah. All right. So if there are no other questions, I want to thank you, Dr. Cheeks, for a wonderful presentation. You gave us our last in-person, well, not in-person, but our last single person presentation, and it was fantastic. And you gave us a lot to think about. Like I said, this is very important work. Yeah, amazing, Dr. Watkins says, because as I said in my introductory remarks, you know, preparing our children with the truth, I mean, that if we don't do that, then they will not be successful in the future. So we have to prepare them as much as we can to I mean, isn't that what we've been doing as a people for centuries? Is, you know, generation after generation, you have to prepare for all the oppression and the hardship. So until it can be eliminated, we have to prepare. All right. So before we close, I want to share with you what our next presentation will be. Next Tuesday, we will have a panel of Black Studies alumni. So 4 previous students who have graduated and gone on, and they're doing wonderful things. So we're going to talk to them. That's going to be Tuesday from 4 o'clock to 5:30. And so we invite all of you to come out. Next week is our final week of programming. So we have 2 panels scheduled for next week. And for those of you who are in Omaha, we're going to have a outside party on Friday. So in order to find out about it, you need to pay attention to your email or come out and join one of our panels next week to find out further details. But until then, I want to thank you again, Dr. Cheeks, for joining us. Thank all of you out in the audience for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Be safe.
Thank you.